Hello and welcome again to Give and Take. This is Jeff Zwerink, and we discuss here the latest scientific issues to help you be more confident in the truth of Christianity so that you can go out and tell others about Jesus. Today I'm joined by Ken Samples and Hugh Ross, and we're going to tackle the question of whether believing in millions of years actually undermines the authority of Scripture. Welcome, Ken and Hugh. It's good to have you here today.
Hey, Jeff.
So, I've heard this charge a lot, that if you believe that the earth is old, millions or billions of years old, that to do so and try and be a Christian means that you're undermining the authority of Scripture. What are the reasons people give for making that claim?
Well, it's based on the idea that the only way to read Genesis 1 literally is if there's 6 consecutive 24-hour periods for creation. So it means you got to squish it down to 144 hours.
Okay, so part of it is an interpretational issue of what's going on in Genesis. So is there anything else at play there?
Well, another big item is that if you have the universe billions of years old, then you got a lot of death and so-called evil taking place before Adam sins.
Okay, so there's not only what are the length of the days, but then there's also
character of God issues.
Character of God issues. Okay,
yeah.
So I think the one other thing I've also heard in there is that it's kind of taking man's authority and putting it on top of God's authority. You're using man's judgment to judge what God has said.
Assuming that's the correct interpretation of Genesis 1.
That's fair. So let's kind of dig into that a little bit. As we get in and look at those creation days, what are the relevant issues? What do we need to be able to understand what's going on there?
Well, it's what is the literal interpretation of Genesis 1? And the thing I noticed the first time I picked up a Bible is that...
So hold on here. When you're talking about Genesis 1, what specifically are we talking? Because there's a lot in Genesis 1.
Okay, we're talking about the account of the 6 creation days.
Okay.
And the definition of the word day.
Okay, so day 1, day 2, those definitions there. Okay.
But you notice even in the English translation, the word day must have at least 3 distinct literal definitions, because 3 are used right there in the text.
Such as?
Well, creation day 1, it's contrasting days and nights. That's the word day referring to the daylight hours. That's
so Yom for daylight is also the same as Yom day 1, day 2.
Well, for example, in creation day 4, it contrasts seasons, days, and years. That's the word day referring to a 24-hour period. Then in Genesis 2:4, he uses that same word day to refer to the entirety of creation history. That's day as a long but finite period of time.
So we're wrestling with this issue of day, and really just even looking in Genesis 1, we've got a fair number of options of what it might mean. So, there are those who argue those are 24-hour days, but if we're going to take Scripture with high authority, they're going to rest in the authority of Scripture, how do we look at the length of those creation days? How do we interpret those?
I think what's interesting here is, of course, we're looking at what a young Earth view would say, and their view is a calendar day view. My observation is they have multiple days. They've got Earth rotation days. They've got solar days. So their view is not consistent in my mind. But let's take a particular day. Let's talk about day 6. When I read what's happening in day 6, there are some pretty profound things taking place.
So tell us what some of those things are.
Adam is put into the garden, and he seems to have 3 careers. He is involved in work as a caretaker for the garden. Then he's engaged in some kind of zoological process of naming the animals. Then he has his marriage to Eve. These are not things that you could mark down to 8 hours. These are more like 3 different lifetimes or 3 careers.
Well, for example, when Adam sees Eve, what does he say?
At long last.
Right.
So this isn't necessarily a knockdown case that these are long days, but it seems to lend a lot of credence to the idea that these are not just 24-hour days, that there's a lot going on, that at the very minimum, you'd have to just say there's something other than humans behaving as humans.
I think you'd be hard-pressed to really have meaningful issues happening, things happening that are so meaningful in life and cram them into 24 hours. that seems a very difficult way to read and understand the Bible.
So are there other, I mean, I know we were talking about Adam and Eve naming the animals and all that goes on in there. What other things lend the idea that these are longer creation days, just looking at Scripture alone?
Well, what impressed me when I first picked up a Bible was that there's an evening and a morning bracketing each of the creation days, telling us that each day has a definite start point and a definite end point. But when you get to the seventh day, there is no evening and morning. And that's the day when God rests from his work of creation. And there's three other biblical texts, Psalm 95, John 5, and Hebrews 4, that tell us we're presently in God's seventh day. It's not finished yet. And when I read that at age 17, I said, this answers the fossil record enigma. We have all this new species of life coming into existence before Adam and Eve, because that's when God's creating life. After Adam and Eve, he stops creating life, which explains why we see virtually little of that today.
So that's a really kind of remarkable idea that the seventh day, which if that's still ongoing today, says that that's a much longer period of time, then by analogy or by inference, you would assume that the other days were not 24-hour days as well. So, I just find that fascinating that, there's this charge that we're pushing science into Scripture, if you will, that the only reason to think that anything other than 24-hour days is because what the scientific record says. But these are things that you're just identifying in the biblical text itself. You're not even looking at what science has to say, except that we kind of know how long it takes to name an animal or at least say something. There's some implication there, but these are just kind of drawn from the biblical text themselves. Am I correct?
Well, the principle is to take it both literally and consistently. Don't just look at a few verses in Genesis 1. Look at the entire context.
I think that's powerful. Ken, can you give me a little perspective? Historically speaking, how has the old earth view fit in? Is that just kind of something that's happened in the last couple hundred years in response to the scientific enterprise?
I think it's very clear that over a long period of time, let me go back to St. Augustine in the 4th and 5th centuries. He does not interpret the creation days as 6 consecutive 24-hour periods. He lives 1,000 years or more before the enterprise of science. So you couldn't possibly argue that science is forcing him to take a different interpretation. People in the ancient world had differing ideas about how long the universe had been around, but the idea that there are 6 consecutive 24-hour periods, or that only a young Earth point of view is to be accepted, I don't think that that's historically tenable.
So let me ask quickly, we got a couple of minutes here left. Part of the charge here is that we're taking science and forcing it into the Bible. I mean, you've kind of identified some of why biblically we think those are longer periods of time, but how do you see, again, shortly, what we find in the scientific record and the biblical record? Would what we find scientifically ever cause you to go and say, the Bible's just got it wrong and we need to put the science here?
Well, God's given us 2 books, the book of nature and the book of scripture. It's from the same God for whom it's impossible to lie or deceive. So if we see a contradiction between the 2 books, it's the problems with our interpretation. We're failing to take both books literally and consistently.
So we have to go do some more study, effectively.
Sure.
Ken, how would you respond there?
I like that idea. Certainly God is the author of both of those books. It could be that one of our interpretations is off base, but I think we have to interpret Scripture and see how it fits in the context of the book of nature. And therefore, we're paying attention to both because Scripture tells us to look at the book of nature, what God has done in the world.
Just like we look at all 66 books of the Bible, not just one book.
Right.
The charge that we just are taking a low view of Scripture or taking man's view over Scripture, really, when you look at it historically, is just not supported. That multiple Many biblical scholars throughout history have looked at those and said they're young earth, maybe they're old earth. It's been a debate that's raised in the Christian church for many, many years, not just because of the scientific record. So to take an old earth view isn't undermining the authority of Scripture. In fact, it's important because it says that we're validating what Scripture has to say and taking it very seriously. And one great benefit, I would say, of an old earth perspective is it gives us a tool to engage in evangelism and get around some of those initial arguments to get to the heart of the matter and talking about who Jesus is. And so I think an old earth view is just very powerful in that vein. So I hope this equips you and encourages you to go out and share the gospel with those around.